A frost rimed the buffalo grass where the rosebud made its slow curves between low, broken ridges. Before sunrise on June 17th, 1876, mule bells tinkled in the half-light, and a long column under Brigadier General George Crook shook itself awake along the creek bottom. Coffee hissed in blackened pots. Men rolled their blankets and tightened saddle cinches. Crow and Shoshone scouts, already mounted, watched the skyline and talked in low voices. The Aleutian fog had nothing to do with Montana, but a ground haze lay in the swales and swallowed sound. The air smelled of damp soil and horse sweat. Somewhere up the valley, a meadowlark sang, like it didn't know a battle was about to start. Crook's force was big on paper: regular cavalry and infantry, civilian packers, teamsters, surgeons. But the country dwarfed it. He had moved north from the Tongue River, sent word to allies, and posted scouts to feel the ground toward the northwest, where Lakota and Northern Cheyenne villages were thought to be. The scouts knew the ground by heart. The enemy did too. For weeks, war parties had come and gone, testing the army's columns and striking at their animals. The men who saddled up that morning carried fresh scars from the spring fights on the Yellowstone. The scouts carried older ones. The attack came in motion, like a wind changing direction. A courier from the Crow Scouts galloped in, breathless with the words, "Riders on the heights to the left, a lot of dust beyond." Crook wheeled his column toward the bluffs. Within minutes, rifle cracks stitched across the draw, and the first bullets hummed through tents still standing. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne under Crazy Horse had crossed the ridges on a broad front, slipping in where the creek bends hide the ground. They came fast, fringed shirts and braids streaming, paint bright even in the new sun. The advance guard of soldiers broke into a run for the high ground, and the pack train lurched as mules tried to bolt. The first hour was confusion shaped by terrain. Companies climbed a spine of rock later called Crook's Ridge and poured steady fire into figures darting between knobs. To the west, more warriors rode hard for the pack train, trying to cut off the army's food and ammunition. The Shoshone scouts under men who had followed Chief Washakie for years kicked their ponies downslope to meet them, and the Crow followed, avalanching off the high ground with whoops that sounded nothing like army bugle calls. The collision was so abrupt, it looked like two storms meeting. Lances jabbed. Short guns fired so close the powder scorched shirts. Horses went down in the first seconds and made ridges of meat the riders had to climb over to keep fighting. Crook tried to knit order out of the ridgeline. He sent Captain Thomas and others to hold the crests, to drive the attackers from folds that would let them fire into the packers. The battle sprawled along nearly a mile of broken land, 7 distinct ridges and hollows, where separate fights burned white-hot and then damped down as each side shifted. Somewhere in that mess, a Cheyenne woman, Buffalo Calf Road woman, rode into the exchange under fire and pulled her wounded brother onto her horse. Cheyenne accounts say the act stiffened the entire line. Warriors who had begun to drift back came on again, hard, yelling that the soldiers would not have the field that day. Late morning hinged on the fate of the packs. Crazy Horse's fighters understood that mules meant cartridges, and cartridges meant a fight that could go on until the soldiers had to quit. Crook's infantry drew a bead on mounted men moving along a saddle and volleyed until the saddle lay quiet. The Crow and Shoshone scouts pressed their own enemies over a lip and down into a shallow basin cut by the creek. They had come north with Crook in part for this day. Some bore old scars from raids that had torn through their families years earlier. The Lakota and Cheyenne were ancestral enemies. Each side kept tallies in their heads of stolen horses, burned lodges, and names spoken low in winter camps. The scouts shouted in their own languages as they fought. One Crow, blood running from a cut at his scalp, laughed through his teeth and told a soldier next to him that this was a good day to even things up. By noon the heat built, and the gun smoke hung under a lid of still air. Both sides had punished the other and were running men and horses hard from one point to another. Crook fed company after company into the broken ground and watched his ammunition chests go light. He wanted the attackers off the pack train and off the ridges where their long rifles could reach down into the camps. In a series of rushes, the scouts and troopers drove the Lakota and Cheyenne across the face of the bluffs and back toward the west forks of the Rosebud. The fighting did not end so much as it folded in on itself. Warriors peeled away in small groups, picking their routes behind the ridges. Soldiers held the crests and fired into dust until there were no more targets to fire at. By mid-afternoon, Crook held the field, but it was a field of spent men and animals. He counted his dead, sent for water, and posted guards who could barely stand. The scouts ranged out to be sure the enemy had truly withdrawn. They came back carrying trophies and news of bodies in the grass. Crow and Shoshone scouts found Lakota and Cheyenne wounded in coulees and finished them with knives or shotguns. A few soldiers tried to intervene and were told plainly to step aside. This was not army business, the scouts said. These were enemies they had fought for a lifetime, men who had raided their camps and cut down their kin. On that ground, with the fight still hot in their lungs, they meant to answer those tallies without mercy. In a small wash below one of the ridges, a teenage warrior lay half-covered by sage, shot through the hip. He held up both hands when a pair of Crow scouts appeared, palms sticky with blood, and spoke words the soldiers did not understand. One Crow, a man old enough to be his father, looked down a long moment, then leveled his pistol. The boy had not spared him years earlier when the positions were reversed, he said later. It wasn't the way of their enemies. The shot carried up the wash and made a private who heard it swallow hard. An infantry sergeant muttered that a battlefield is poor soil for charity, and another man answered that charity has to start somewhere. No one moved. The war was made up of moments like that, and most of them stayed unwritten. When the light fell, Crook counted the day a draw he could not afford. He had stopped Crazy Horse from rolling up his line and taking his packs. He had not broken the enemy. He held councils that night and the next, and chose caution. With men worn down and ammunition low, he fell back toward his base on Goose Creek to refit. The decision would echo a week later on the Little Bighorn when George Custer, looking for Crook's column that never came, rode alone into history. At Rosebud, Crook's pause meant the villages in the valleys west could move as they wished for a few more days without a fresh blue line on their heels. The winter counts and army reports do not agree on the numbers, but they agree on the scale. Hundreds on each side engaged, dozens killed, and many more wounded. Cheyenne storytellers remembered the day as where the girl saved her brother. Crow elders remembered the day as one where old debts finally got voices. In both tellings, the shape of the land matters. The short ridges, the narrow draws, the creek that snakes just enough to turn a line into a scatter of separate fights. The reprisal that gave the day its bitter aftertaste did not end with the sun going down. In the days after, scouting parties trailed small groups of Lakota and Cheyenne moving their wounded. Where they could, they struck and took scalps. Some of the men who swung the knives had been spared once in winter camps when enemies let captives go rather than kill them. Mercy, they said now, had not been repaid with mercy. Whether their memory named the right faces in that haze was a thing no one could test. On the Rosebud, some of those same men set their jaws and chose to make the reckoning personal. It was a loop that ran hot in the 1870s and would keep running until Washington's terms and hunger pressed the free-roaming bands onto agencies. For soldiers who wrote letters home, the day read as ordered chaos. They described a fight that started when they were still making coffee and ended with shirts stiff from sweat and dust. One captain, trying to be precise for a wife who asked, wrote that the enemy were gallant and obstinate, that he had watched a woman ride into rifle fire to pull a fallen man up behind her. Another, less generous, wrote only that the country was bad, the enemy clever, and that the scouts did work I will not describe. In the Crow and Shoshone camps, people sat up late around small fires and traced the line from old raids to the shallow graves just dug near Goose Creek. They did not pretend the line was neat. They did not pretend it would end with that day. Years later, when grass had healed the hoof scars on the ridges, the battlefield lay quiet under the big Montana sky. You can stand there now and see what they saw. The low swell of ground that hides 100 riders, the cut bank that gives cover for men on foot, the sudden openness where a pack train would be naked if the line broke. The Rosebud still moves like a thing that doesn't hurry. The wind still comes up in the afternoon and talks in the sage. Memory fills the rest. The crowded ridge crests, the short gasps at a run, the hammer of a Springfield, the deep certainty some men carried that a moment once survived must be rebalanced with another. The fight at Rosebud was a hinge in a campaign, but it was also a turning of an older wheel, one built on raids and returns, mercy given and mercy withheld. When the lights go down in the mind and the voices of that day fade, what remains is the sound that started it, mule bells, a meadowlark, and then the first distant crack rolling down the valley. Men stumbled to their feet and reached for rifles because everything that mattered in that summer of 1876 was being decided on the ridges ahead. By evening, the ridges held their secrets again, and the creek slid past them like always. The men who walked away carried the battle with them, in letters, in night sweats, in stories told at the edge of campfires where smoke climbs straight up in the cool after a hot day. They carried the knowledge that sometimes the ones who live through a raid and swear to remember do exactly that, and the next time, they do not spare. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.